Snow on Garvax 9 never fell, it hunted. It came in sheets that knifed sideways, hissing through basalt ribs and ironwood stands, filling every seam of the world with a cold that sounded like teeth. In the throat of one such ravine, a cavern yawned where heat had once lived. The walls were charred, the air stank of burnt protein and ozone, and the floor glittered with shell dust like spilled stars. 3 albino hatchlings, wet-frilled, pink-horned, ancient in instinct and new at everything else, trembled under the collapsed wing of their mother. She had died the way good queens do, curving her body into a shelter the storm could not reason with, keeping the cold from the soft places until even her furnace went dark. Outside the cave mouth, poacher drones hovered with the patience of carrion. They were all edges, triangular frames, pivoting optics, spars painted the dun color of men who planned to leave no story behind. Their scanners wrote red in the snow. The red bled toward the cave. Far across the flats, a transport older than the war thumped over an ice shelf, bucked, caught itself, and shuddered on. The windshield was a lace of stress cracks. The cabin smelled of coffee boiled one too many times and insulation baked one too few. Thorn Bell, grease under his nails, conduit wire looped around his wrist like a rosary for the faithless, smacked the tack with the heel of his hand until the needle told a useful lie. He didn't belong here. He belonged on the warm side of a shop door, coaxing heat from grudging pipes and listening to the hum of the world behave. The radio coughed static. A new thread snuck through, a pulse thinner than a moth's wing beat, bright with panic. He frowned and tuned past the official bands, past homing beacons and research chatter, past the automated storm advisories that said, turn back, turn back, turn back. The pulse sharpened into a pattern that wasn't meant for him. It wasn't meant for any human. It was bioelectric, cast on frequencies old as the planet's first dawn. It was meant for mothers. Thorn didn't know the language, but he knew the sound. He'd heard it once in a barrio clinic when the power failed and 6 incubators decided to die of bureaucratic neglect. He'd pulled fuses with his teeth and wired car batteries with shaking hands until the little machines remembered their jobs. The sound the babies made, thin, furious, demanding that the universe keep its side of the bargain, that was the sound riding his dash now, encoded in air, skipping across the ice toward anyone with a spine. He scrubbed a thumbnail across the calluses on his palm and looked east, where the cliffs sharpened like broken teeth. The safe road bent west. He didn't turn with it. He fed the transport more torque than it deserved and muttered, "All right, I hear you," into a cabin that had no gods. Every meter worsened the weather. Ice powder scoured the paint to primer. Gusts shoved at the transport with both hands. He threaded through ironwoods that groaned like old ships and skimmed a pressure ridge where new ice had shouldered up against old and lost the argument. The cliffs reared up, threw back the snow, and let him into their lee with the suspicious grace of killers eyeing a guest. The pulse on the radio sharpened, then jumped, the universal rhythm of a heart learning how to keep going under poor instruction. He cut the engine and coasted the last 20 meters, not from stealth, but because the fuel pump's death rattle would have woken the mountain. He stepped into the storm and felt it try to eat his face. His suit fought bravely for 3 seconds and then settled for basic triage. The ravine swallowed him, the wind dropped to a growl, and the signal turned from heard to hear. The cave mouth was a black geometry cut from white. Laser light made a ghost of itself on the drifting snow. He saw the drones, the long guns and ugly hands, the glint of tubes met for trophies and currency. He saw the wing, the mother's last good act, and the small movement under it that made the world a different place. Thorn Bell had never been a soldier. He was the man you called when your heater quit in midwinter, when your air scrubber wheezed, when your drone threw an error code and you needed it to fly because your rent depended on it. He had buried as many machines as he had revived. He had not yet buried a child. He put his shoulder to a boulder and slid around it, counting with his breath, inventorying the tools on his belt like a litany. Arc welder, plasma spanner, ceramic cable ties, thermal patch, lies, hope. He took one more breath, tasted cold and copper and ash, and went to work. The first drone died fast and ugly. Thorn punched the transport's throttle, slewed the rusted beast into a skid, and sent a 1/4 ton of regret into the machine's face. Metal screamed, optics burst, a wing pinwheeled into the dark like a murderous snowflake. The blast knocked 2 poachers on their asses and made the others remember their weapons. Bolts sizzled through the thinning smoke. He dove, slid on his knees across glare ice, and came up behind a stalagmite with the arc welder in one hand and the plasma spanner in the other. "Who the hell?" one of them said, which was apparently the last thing he ever said. The spanner left Thorn's hand and crossed the space like a thrown verdict. It hit the visor with a convincing crack. The man pitched forward and stayed. The remaining 3 recovered quickly, the way men do when this is their job. They fanned out and began to walk Thorn into a wedge. He backed toward the cave mouth on purpose, not because he thought he could win here, but because the alternative was losing out there, where the hatchlings had no walls between them and the wind. Lasers cut the air where his head had been. He answered with sparks and ugly angles, blooming arcs of blinding blue to break their sight lines and make their optics lie about where he was. The drones recovered their patterns. One stitched a line of fire through the air that would have peeled a truck. He threw himself into the cave on instinct and skidded beneath the mother's wing into a world that smelled so fiercely of iron and milk and burnt scale that his eyes watered behind the shield. The hatchlings hissed, a thread of sound like a flexed saw blade. One struck with ridiculous solemnity and bit his glove. It barely dimpled the polyweave, but some honorable part of him made a note. Brave. "I'm on your side," he breathed, and because vows do not count until they cost something, he made it expensive. He rolled onto his back, ripped open the front of his suit, and yanked out the square of his personal heat core. The sacrifice no one on a sane planet volunteers to make. Cold slashed in through the gap like a knife. His breath fogged and fell as glitter. With hands already stiffening, he jammed the core into the auxiliary port on his back plate and rerouted every spare watt into the front of his suit. The vest pulsed, then glowed dully as the little batteries woke. He stripped his jacket in a motion that would have been graceful if it hadn't hurt and made a nest of it, shoving fabric into the curve where the mother's wing met the stone. One hatchling tumbled into the warmth by accident and then by conviction. The second tried to run toward a dark corner, toward the remembered shape of a den that was no longer there. And he caught it with both hands, his fingers firm enough to be telling and soft enough not to be a second injury. The third refused to stop yelling at the concept of existence. He scooped it up and tucked it against the heat of his chest. Its feet pattered against his ribs, frantic and ancient. He turned his body so they could hear his heart, that old metronome that had talked other small things out of panic. Footsteps crunched outside, men speaking an alphabet of curses. The beam of a rifle crawled over the cave ceiling and found the wing's edge. Thorn didn't kid himself that the dead mother would protect them twice. He dragged the wing down an inch with both hands, buying 3 seconds with leverage and guilt, and rolled his body over the hatchlings the way she had, closing what gaps he could. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. He did it anyway. He could feel their breaths now, 3 little engines, one faster than was wise, one erratic, one deciding whether to panic or sleep. He palmed the erratic one's belly and pressed, not to restrain, to remind. He tapped a rhythm on soft ribs, quietly, steadily, the beat of everything that had ever gone right in a bad place. The frantic one hiccuped, then hiccuped again, then found a slower lane in which to drive. The loud one quieted into the kind of whimper that hurt less than the silence that would have followed it. "Hey," he whispered, not to the hatchlings but to his own hands. "Steady now." Light flooded the cave mouth, stark, surgical, the green sheen of a hunter optic. A man stepped over the threshold with boots that believed in ownership. Thorn's right shoulder was already slick with cold sweat. He reached blind to his left and found, by miracle or geography, a shard of obsidian half buried in ash. Its edge was a rumor. It would cut if someone asked nicely. "Put the little assets down," the man said, voice filtered by a helmet that cared more about climate than conscience. The rifle leveled. The optic licked Thorn's chest and found 3 small suns sleeping where no contract said they should be. Thorn didn't have a speech. He had a body and tools and a line where he finally stopped moving out of the way. He slid the shard under his forearm, lifted his elbow, and prepared to make the kinds of mistakes people forgive when they're the last ones available to make. Behind the man, the remaining drone clicked to full charge. It hummed. It aimed with clean mathematics and no temper. Thorn shifted to keep the hatchlings under the highest curve of his ribs and pressed his mouth to the top of the loud one's head. "Hold on," he said again, and the cave breathed with him. And then the last drone fired. The bolt punched through the cave's cold like a nail driven by God. Heat slapped his ribs, then vanished into a numbness so complete it felt like falling out of his own skin. The rifleman did not miss. The drone didn't either. The shot had been meant to shear the wing bone of a fleeing hatchling. Thorn had put himself between math and target, and the equation rewrote itself through meat. He didn't waste the breath it would take to scream. The shard of obsidian under his forearm became a lever. He rolled, presenting the smallest angle of flesh, and rammed the arc welder into the rock beside him. Blue glare blossomed, savage and close, washing the cave in a stutter of light that turned optics blind for a heartbeat. He used the heartbeat like a tool. The spanner, still lodged in a dead man's visor, lay 2 meters out. Impossible. He ignored it and palmed the drone's shadowed glide, feeling for the note a motor makes when it's about to overdraw. The hatchling pressed under his jaw keened, a thin filament of sound that set his molars humming. The drone's gyros hiccuped. Not much. Enough. The rifleman fired again, high this time, startled by light and the way the air itself seemed to shiver. Thorn jammed the welder's tip into a puddle of melt and squeezed the trigger. The arc bucked, met water, through a sheet of steam and a dirty corona of ions. Electronics hate swampy fields more than they hate knives. The drone's aim staggered. Its beam carved a glowing scar across stone instead of hatchling. "You're done," Thorn told his failing shoulder, and drove his elbow down onto a jut of slag. Pain went white, then red, then practical. The hot iron stink told him what the sound language couldn't, cauterized. He dragged a breath through teeth that wanted to chatter and made his hands behave. The rifleman recovered first, profession, not courage, and stepped into the wing's shadow to angle a clean shot. He didn't get it. The loud hatchling, all-pink horn in outrage, found a pitch no helmet baffle was built to love. The man flinched, half a blink only, but a blink is a river to a desperate mind. Thorn slid low, hooked his boot around the man's ankle, and yanked. Weight met ice. The rifle clattered, the shot burned the ceiling. Thorn came up with the obsidian shard and drove it where visor met collar ring. Ceramic kissed polymer. Skipped, found soft. He pushed until the drone's hum became the loudest thing in the room. The last machine wanted a clear field. Its software didn't understand love or vows. It understood line of sight. It banked to the mouth and cut in for a shot at the cluster of heat signatures he was trying to be. Thorn wrenched the welder's cable free of its housing and bit the insulation with his teeth until copper showed like a bright vein. His suit's core flared a warning across his HUD. Overdraw, idiot. And he overrode it with the flick that had kept a dozen heaters alive through a dozen winters. He jammed the bare leads into a crack in the floor and squeezed the trigger one more time. The cave strobed. The drone's optics, mid-aperture, died seemed too much. It yawed like a drunk, clipped the rock lip, and careened with a death insect's mindless anger straight into the mother's wing. Bone that had denied the storm finally gave with a wet sound. The drone cracked. Its battery did what hurt batteries do, and turned heat into a small, ugly sun. Thorn threw himself over the hatchlings and rode the wave of hot air with his back. The welder's leads banged against his knuckles, singing. The drone's carcass spat shrapnel. A fragment nicked his ear. Warmth ran down his neck and went cold immediately in the draft. The rifleman made one last bad decision and lunged for a weapon. The welder replied with a line of blue that introduced metal to tendon and opinion to gravity. Silence tried to land. It didn't. The mountain rolled something massive and alive across the throat of the ravine, and the light at the cave mouth changed color. Snow came off the ground in sheets as if gravity had coughed. The taste in the air flipped from ozone to mineral and something clean, like new water running over old stone. Wings eclipsed the world. She entered like weather obeys an older law. Albino, plated in the pale armor that makes lightning look like a painter with bad taste. Eyes the color of glacier ice left in sun. Her head filled the mouth of the cave. The breath that leaked between her teeth raised steam from Thorn's flayed suit. She saw everything at once, the way mothers do, the enfilade of dead men, the bite of heat on melted polymer, the human folded over the impossible survivors, the black scorch smearing the wing that had held. She could have ended him without a thought. The air around her jaws wavered with the kind of power that makes rocks reconsider their life choices. Instead, she extended her neck until her nostrils hovered a handspan from his face and inhaled the map he wore. She found fear and didn't care. She found blood and evaluated it. She found the sweet medicinal sugar of the gel on his fingers, the salt of a human who had burned his own heat away to keep smaller furnaces from failing, the scorched polymer of a suit repurposed against its will. She found the hatchling's scent on his ribs, on his collarbones, on his stupid, stubborn hands. Thorn's lips were too cold for the shape of speech. He lifted his chin an inch so the smallest wouldn't lose its purchase, and did the only thing left that counted. He showed his empty palm, sugar sticky and shaking, and set it down flat on the stone in the universal grammar of surrender. The great head tipped. The huge eye, ringed with old scar tissue, clever with the kind of intelligence that requires no translation, narrowed as if tasting the idea of him. Her breath washed across the nest. The hatchling's frantic chest settled into something that wanted, for the first time since birth, to be called regular. More wings folded into the ravine's mouth, white shapes held, unwilling to crowd judgment. The matriarch made her decision without roaring. She slid the wreckage of the wing away as gently as if stone were skin, nosed the dead drone aside, and reached with all the care in the world to lift the loudest of the three out of Thorn's jacket. It protested. Of course it did, then felt her breath and remembered a larger geometry. She set it back when its panic had burned down to ash. Thorn's body had kept its side of the bargain as long as it could. His vision narrowed to a tunnel with a bright, absurd rim. He managed one more inventory, 3 small engines still running. His own stuttering but serviceable, the great engine in front of him tuned to mercy rather than fire, and let go with the indignity of a man whose last act before unconsciousness was to whisper, "They're yours," into a world that had decided to agree. He woke to a ceiling that glowed from the inside. Veins of crystal ran like lightning trapped in glass over basalt smoothed by centuries of bodies. Heat moved through the floor in measured pulses, a low line of blue fire coursing channels that had not been cut for spectacle but for function. The air smelled of mineral and milk and the clean char that clings to places where fire has worked and then been asked politely to leave. He lay on something that cradled without staggering, a platform of stone layered with a weave he recognized only as the product of long patience. Fibers braided, dried, lacquered by heat and time into a softness that didn't apologize for being strong. A weight warmed his hip. He looked. A hatchling, the loud one, had collapsed across his thigh with the indolent authority of royalty napping on a servant who had proved durable. Around him, silence practiced being many things at once. The soft hiss of vents exchanging air, the tick of water counting itself drop by drop into a basin, the layered undertone of lungs, 50, 100, breathing together because it had seemed wise to do so. He slid a palm over his ribcage and found bandaging that wasn't cloth, resin smelling faintly of sap laid over a seal of ash and something medicinal he couldn't name. His shoulder felt like a bad decision petitioning to be overturned. It obeyed when asked to lift. They were watching, not like guards, like engineers who have left a machine running overnight and come back to see if their faith was paid. Elders on ledges, eyes steady. Yearlings stacked on a rim, failing not to lean. Mothers near the cradle, a dish of basalt worn concave by generations, throats slightly open, breath humid, making the air kind by will. He tried to stand and thought better of it 2 inches up. Pride wanted to make a speech. Utility won. He sat, toes on warm stone, and raised both hands, palms up, to the matriarch where she lounged with the contained mass of a storm behind glass. "I can help," he said, and hated that his voice chose a rasp. Not with, he gestured at her impossible body, that, with the other kind, the kind that makes it hard for men like those to find you again. She did not blink. She lowered her head until horn scraped stone with a chalky whisper and looked at his hands. Scar lines, a fresh lattice of burns, sugar residue drawn into the creases, He turned one palm so she could see where the gel had dried. She inhaled, evaluating the chemistry. No lies there. She raised her head, the motion careful enough to be ceremonial without being a ceremony. He took that as permission to spend more words. Your distress call. The bioelectric one? It's bouncing off the old survey grid. That's how the poachers sniffed it. I can cage it, keep it local, or bury it under noise they won't parse until their grandkids are bored. I can turn your heat leaks into lies. I can teach your vents to sing cold on the outside and warm in. If they come again, they'll find a blank mountain and a weather report that says, go home. He paused because he'd run out of breath, not argument. His chest hurt in a way that felt productive. He looked at the nearest hatchling, whose idea of responsibility involved chewing on the strap of his torn vest, and added, I'm a mechanic. We don't win wars. We make it possible for families to sleep. A dragon with a kinked horn and clay staining her muzzle slid a shallow bowl across the floor with one foreclaw until it tapped his boot. Melt trembled in it, a skin just shy of boiling. He lifted it with both hands, because everything in this room demanded 2 hands, and drank. It tasted like the inside of a mountain learning to be kind. When he set it down, the matriarch exhaled once. Not heat. Consent. Work arrived like a friend who doesn't knock. He asked for 3 things and was given 10. The carcass of a drone had been dragged in, its rotors intact, its brain fried. He stripped the stabilizers and turned their coils into a choke for the den's signal, tuning the frequency down into the bones where only the pack would hear it. He found a cracked lens, polished it with the hem of his ruined shirt, and set it over a vent mouth to scatter heat into a pattern the outside would read as bare rock, still cooling from a century ago. He chewed a ribbon of resin, the elder nudged into his palm, and used it to glue a hairline crack in the channel, feeding the blue fire so it would stop singing sour when the draft leaned wrong. He spoke while he worked because rooms like this need words to learn. You're not trying to trick them. Your vents are art. Whoever cut these knew the way heat wants to flow. You don't need me telling you how to be dragons. I just know how to edit machines. That's all this is. Editing. A yearling crept too close to a test lead and received a flick of tail across the toes from a nearby aunt with the accuracy of a thrown knife. Thorn saw himself in that motion and grinned before he could stop it. The yearling pretended not to have been corrected, looked at him under heavy lids, then settled to watch as if this had been his plan. When the first avalanche rumbled on the far side of the ridge, the mountain clearing its throat with bad timing, he took it as a cue. He pulled the power cell from the dead drone and braided it into the transport's emergency beacon he'd hauled in and propped against the wall. He wired the pair into the signal choke and pointed the ugly antenna at the cliff face. Let them chase this, he said, and flipped the switch. The den's low hum thickened for a moment, then leveled as the false pulse rolled back along the survey grid in a pattern convincing enough to sell to a bored customs agent. If the poachers were still listening, they'd go a valley over and waste a day shooting at ghosts. He didn't ask for thanks. The matriarch provided something better. She descended the ledge and approached with the slowness of a machine brought within tolerances. She lowered until the thick seam where plate becomes skin, the vulnerable place under the jaw, rested on the stone within reach of his hand. She left it there, the way a sovereign leaves a question in the air to see what answer the room prefers. He didn't touch. The lesson had been learned hard and fast. There are things you keep warm with proximity and things you keep safe by not taking what isn't yours. He let his hand hover for a breath and then set it, instead, flat on the cradle's rim beside the smallest head. The hatchling leaned into his fingers with the rude assurance of someone for whom the world had started, finally, to make sense. The pack adjusted its weight as a unit, that subtle, ground-felt shift 100 bodies make when they agree without speeches. The old uncle placed his chin at the den mouth in a posture that has comforted children in a dozen species, and watched the doorway until watching became a habit instead of a task. The blue line in the floor dimmed to the faintest of glows, the kind that warms stones without bragging to the air. Night found them. Thorn propped against a pillar that fit his spine like a brace made by a generous god. Dragons arranged around the cradle in rings that were not fences but promises. The hatchlings breathing in a new meter that belonged to this place and to him only in the way that anything beloved belongs to anyone. By care, not by claim. He slept with his palm open on the stone, and when a small head found it in the dark, pressed into it with a sigh and slept harder. He did not move. Morning came on padded feet, stroking the den along edges worn smooth by generations. The floor fire traced its narrow path with the composure of a pulse. Thorn woke beneath a careful stack of promises. One hatchling sprawled along his ribs, another tucked into the hollow of his shoulder, a third draped across his thigh as if cataloging him for later. He lay still and let their heat educate his bones. Work, when it arrived, did not trumpet. The matriarch tipped her head toward a vent that hummed 2 notes too low. He levered a mica shard into its lip until the cord rose and stopped pulling drafts across sleeping bellies. He shaved the burr from a channel so the blue line would stop coughing at sharp turns. He wired the drone coils into the choke he'd built and walked the signal by hand around the den, listening for places where metal would betray them. Yearlings shadowed him, learning how close to curiosity fire will allow without changing its mind. By midlight, the weather had done that desert miracle and turned clear, which on Garvax 9 meant honest danger. Far across the flats, a point of glare grew where nothing good lives. Thorn checked the choke, then the decoy, then the resistance values of a system he had coaxed from junk and nerve. The glare became a skiff. Its belly was the ugly geometry of men who come to places they don't love for things they don't deserve. He didn't ask permission to move. He took a coil of cable, 3 thermal flares, the cracked lens he'd turned into a scatterer, and a bag of salt mixed with iron filings that would make a brief, persuasive lie in the air. The matriarch watched him sling the cable over his shoulder. She lowered her head and clipped the end of it in her teeth for a breath, a gesture like a notarization. He grinned without meaning to. "I'll bring it back," he said, and she let go. Outside, the world had put on its cold face again. Wind sheared flat across the basin. The skiff's thrusters kicked a dirty halo of crystallized air. Thorn set the first flare against a rock and built it a hood of mirror shards so its heat would throw upward and pretend to be a newborn vent. He bolted the cracked lens to a cairn so warm air would lift, break against glass, and write its signature in scrap handwriting. Any sensor would read as geology instead of blood. The skiff drifted lower, confident with a predator's math. A hatch popped on its underside. A drum rolled out on a parachute. Air sniffer, new model, built to smell truth through 4 kinds of lies. He swore under his breath and popped the cap on his salt and iron bag. The wind took it like gossip. He lit the second flare and snapped a wick of resin over it. The smoke went hot bright, then dark, then hot again, beating a stuttering pattern that sent the sniffer the story of a vent sputtering under ice. Numbers told numbers lies. Machines believed. The drum still found its way toward the den mouth. Thorn sprinted, skidding across glassed basalt to a cusp where the cliff threw its shadow. He jammed the third flare into a crack, struck it, and climbed the cable he'd wedged there 2 nights ago against exactly this stupidity. Up on the ridge, he felt the skiff's shadow pass over like a migraine. He turned the scatterer on and pointed it into the wind. The warm air the den exhaled, slight, constant, ran into his glass and broke like water on rock, fanning into a pattern that looked old. He fed power into the choke until his hacked beacon groaned. The faux distress pulse bloomed a valley to the east, bright enough to deserve a raid. The skiff's pilot took the bait almost but not quite. The air sniffer bloomed a petal of sensors and sniffed the edge of the den's breath. The numbers on somebody else's screen refused to line up with caution. Thorn splayed his fingers on the scatterer, felt the heat begin to eat the glue he'd made in a hurry, and thought, just hold. Wind rose like temper. The flare in the crack hissed and guttered, then flared bright as the resin burned through. Heat beat upward in a muscle of air. The skiff shifted to compensate. Thorn yanked the cable hard, dislodging a plate he'd set loose a day ago with the same quiet guilt sculptors feel when they weaken good stone for art. The plate slid, shoved a second, then a third. Snow and fine glass poured off the lip in a glittering waterfall that was not avalanche so much as a lesson in friction. The air sniffer blinked and tilted, its parachute filled wrong. It skated the gusts, swung, kissed the ridge, and punched itself to pieces in a delicate explosion of disappointed engineering. The skiff veered, re-evaluated, and committed the error cowards make when pride is in the room. It circled once to send a last contemptuous scan over the den and left to chase the louder ghost. Thorn stood with his hands braced on his knees, trying to convince his heart to change keys. He had bought a day or a week. He had not bought forever. That problem belonged to tomorrow's wire. He slipped on the way down. His boot found no purchase where he'd made the mountains smooth. He felt the world tilt and accepted the truth gravity tells faces. The cable held the first time, then slicked through his glove. He swore and grabbed with his idiot-injured shoulder. The joint stung electric. Decency made a new attempt at quitting him. A white shape burned up from the basin and simply replaced the physics under him. The matriarch shouldered the air into a platform, slid under his hips, and let him drop onto the span of her neck, as if he'd always been meant to be there. He laid his cheek along the warm seam where plate became skin, and laughed once, too high to be attractive. "I had it," he said, and understood from the way she did not answer that everyone was allowed one necessary lie per day. Back in the den, he finished what the fall had started, tore the last of his suit to make patches for the places the hatchlings preferred. The yearlings gathered too close. An ant laced her tail across their paws without looking away from the doorway. The matriarch lowered herself to his height and exhaled in a long, slow line over his chest, not burning, not cold, but a temperature that settled right under the breastbone. The room shifted its weight as one animal. He didn't look down to see if the heat had written a mark on him. He looked at the three ridiculous faces that had gone to sleep with their chins on his knee and decided he could accept being labeled. Night rethreaded the den with quiet. Far off, the false distress call he had sown into the hills married itself to the survey grid and ran to waste the hours of men who did not deserve any. Inside, tools cooled on stone. He slept at last, and when a small head found his hand in the dark and pressed, the mountain remembered the shape of his name and kept it until morning. The days made a rhythm. He woke beneath the little weights he'd earned. He tuned vents, split stones, oiled hinges in a place that didn't know it had hinges, until a human convinced it to admit the word. The pack mapped their new safety across their own bodies. Out on the flats, the skiff returned once with a bigger sniffer and left with a dull dataset and a short temper. Someone tried a ground approach and tripped a ring of wire he had braided into the ice. Sensors screamed at phantoms all night while the den slept. He taught the hatchlings two ideas he believed in more than advice: gentle and stay. Gentle meant a pink mouth opening and closing on his sleeve without puncture. Stay meant he placed his palm flat on warmed stone and breathed slow until they matched him. Dragons are not dogs. They learn what they respect and ignore what they don't. The little ones learned him. He learned their graphs, the way one's energy spiked and crashed like weather, the way another's attention braided itself around a single sound for hours, the way the loudest loved in straight lines and forgave like weathered wood. It was nearly a thaw when the den decided to change shape. The elders uncoiled from their winter patience. Heat came up from the floor, a fraction more generous. The matriarch stood, and the room arranged itself around the decision before she made it. First flight is where a species stores its theology. You do it badly, or you do it late, and the world writes harsher rules for everything after. He argued exactly once. "They're small," he said. An idiot in love with caution, and the matriarch tapped his shoulder with a horn and looked at the cliff in a way that informed him the argument had never been about size. They did not throw babies at the sky. They built the low version of a stair. He knelt in the dust at the cradle's edge. The ramp rose to a shelf as high as his waist where warmed air slipped into a lazy current. A dozen bodies took their places along the route, each a stone underfoot, each a correction waiting to be given. The room tightened its hum until it had the energy of a drawn bow. The loud one stood on the highest point of Thorn's sternum, found his heartbeat with both forefeet, and pushed off with the solemnity of a ridiculous king. It flew the length of 3 dragons and fell like comedy into the hollow of the matriarch's foreclaw. It looked offended for exactly the time it took to inhale, and then boiled with joy. The second went farther and landed worse. The third ran in place on polished basalt, slid backward a foot, screamed at physics, and then did something else with its legs that counted. They tried again with the amplitude of the newly convinced. Elders murmured correction in a language made mostly of breath. Yearlings stood on their own tails to keep from testing the law of example. Thorn clapped without clapping. He breathed the count in through his teeth and sent it under the noise where small lungs could pick it up and pretend it was their idea. After 6 tries, the loud one made a decent arc. After 10, it made an indecently good one and lay on the matriarch's wrist panting as if it had invented wind. On the ridge across the basin, 2 human figures appeared and did not descend. Even at that distance, he read the posture. Hands open, shoulders low, the cautious grief of people who've taken part in a bad story and are trying to see if a better one will admit them as readers. He didn't wave. The matriarch didn't lift a head. The mountain did the one decent thing large things can do for smaller ones. It pretended to be alone with them. The pack went up, not all at once, not as a stunt. They moved the way a choir stands when the note is too large for a single throat and more beautiful for the attempt. The matriarch flowed under him in the practiced curl that had rescued him from the ridge and took his weight into the hollow that belonged to no one else. The hatchlings arranged themselves with entitlement between his chest and her wing. They rose on a column of slow air the den had been nursing all morning. The cliff fell back like a curtain dropped between acts. The flats spread like a promise, finally notarized. From above, the wreck he had crashed into a drone read as a harmless heap, the black ribbon of the ravine as a long sentence that had resolved. They skimmed the edge of the basin until wind learned its manners. The yearlings chased their own competence and were fetched back by tails with the delicacy of a librarian retrieving a book from a toddler. The elders made a figure 8 with a dignity so absurd it passed for danger. The hatchlings shouted into air so thin the sound turned to light. At the crest of the loop, the matriarch did something he had only ever felt in rooms. She placed her brow briefly against his chest and held it there until the heat under his sternum, the one she had left there with her breath, answered. The mark did not burn, it oriented. He put his palm flat to acknowledge, the same way he had at the cradle, and the sky adjusted around the agreement. They wheeled once over the den mouth. Inside, the ledger glittered, the black glass wall where old scratches recorded births and winters. She did not add a symbol. The new rule had already been entered when she warmed her breath into his bones. Still, she tipped her horn toward it, and he understood what it would say if it needed ink. Not his name, not their word for kin, but a simpler sentence. Kept. They landed to the applause stone gives, slight, specific, felt in the arches of feet. The hatchlings performed the 2 inelegant jumps that make skill from luck and collapsed against his side with the grumpy triumph of children overdue for sleep. The matriarch stood at the mouth of the den and watched the world remember itself. The old uncle pretended to snore to make the room laugh. A yearling sidled up and laid a cracked censer plate, stolen from a poacher's boot, at Thorn's foot with such seriousness he had to accept it, as if it were a coronation. Night pulled itself on like a soft shirt. The blue line in the floor lay down to embers. The vent's new song held. Far away in some officer's feed, ghosts in the next valley still beckoned. In here, breath did the good arithmetic. 3 small engines, 100 large, 1 human body that had decided to belong where his work fit. He slept with his hand open on warm stone. A small head found it. The mountain kept that truth the way only large old things can. Without gossip, without pride, and for as long as necessary.